Hello and welcome to Worlds Apart. 3 years after the eruption of violence in Ukraine, the conflict still remains a battle of identity for Kyiv, but not so much for Moscow or Brussels. Increasingly preoccupied by their own internal challenges, both Russia and the European Union would much rather leave Ukraine to its own devices. But can it survive in such a geopolitical limbo? No longer with the East, not yet with the West. Well, to discuss that, I'm now joined by Erhard Busek, former Vice Chancellor of Austria. Dr. Busek, it's great to talk to you. Thank you very much for your time. Now, I know that you are often asked about the issue of European identity, European values, what it means to be European. And that very interesting philosophical question was right at the center of still is at the center of the Ukrainian conflict. 3 years ago, when the protests started gathering at Maidan Square in Kyiv, it was formulated roughly like that. Here is a dark and oppressive Russia, here's a bright and shiny European Union, and innocent, free-loving Ukraine in the middle. Now that Ukraine has been freed from the deadly embrace of Russia, what's next? What's next for Ukraine? What's next for Europe? What's next for Russia?
I think in the perception of the whole conflict, there are a lot of mistakes. I think sometimes it is not understood by the Russians that some things like Crimea and so on are critically seen by international law. But I think there are a lot of mistakes on the Western side. There's a differentiation on the Western side. I think the Americans have a certain perception. That's not mine, and I think it's also not the perception of the whole Europeans. I think there's a tendency to look at the things at white-black.
But where does it come from? Because we thought at least that we were all adults. Sure, Russia has its challenges with the rule of law, with building of its institutions, with the authoritarian tendencies in its government. But I think it was really striving throughout the 90s to do something of itself. And all of a sudden, in 2013, we heard that we were those backward, oppressive people who don't give a heck about anything good in this world. Where did it come from?
This is a result of a kind of simplification, which is done on the Western side. I think...
Do you think it was genuine or was it deliberate?
I think it was not deliberate. It was, it changed never really. I think the perception in the West, the Western European, concerning the changes in Russia, were not going really to the subjects. I think it was for a very long time Russia of Stalin, very primitive, and what was in differentiation was not really seen. I think maybe the perception of the changes, even done by Gorbachev, did not go in the right direction. And afterwards, I think for a lot of people, it was not clear that there was a tremendous change in Russia happening. For sure, you need a time to consume it. It's not happening from one day to the other. And I think everybody has to learn out of the own history. Mm-hmm. Now, and if it is coming back to critical confrontation, then the old images are coming up.
But I think at that point of time, nobody really, either on the EU side nor on Russia side, realized that it was actually approaching that very critical confrontational moment. And I want to ask you about the second part of this Manichaean image of the bright and shiny European Union. Where did that image come from? Because the European Union, as successful as it was also having its own struggles. Do you think the clash over Ukraine had anything to do with EU's own internal doubts?
I don't think so. I think, first of all, I have to say quite straight, the knowledge about Ukraine within the European Union is very limited. I think they have no real knowledge. So it's one of the advantages of the Austrians. We have a little bit more knowledge. I think a lot of Austrians are wondering that sometimes Russians are saying, Ukraine, this is nothing else than a part of Russia by history, looking to the baptism in Kiev around 1000 and so on and so on. I think that's not really understood. And so far, that's one of the difficulties.
But I agree with you on that particular point. But I think when Russians say that, and the Russian president often says that he personally believes that Russians and Ukrainians came from the same sort of ethnic pool, from the same cultural pool. It's never being argued that Ukraine is no different from Russia. It is never been argued that Ukraine does not have the right to sovereignty, does not have the right to self-determination. Don't you think that perhaps Russians too could have, articulated the ideas a little bit better? Because I could understand how offensive could that be to the Ukrainians.
For sure, it is a learning process. I think the Ukrainians have to learn on themselves. That's one of the difficulties. I remember my first visit of a kind of independent Ukraine. I met my vis-a-vis, the vice president of the Ukrainian government. He was speaking to me in the Russian language. And at a certain moment, when we started our official talks, now I have to switch to the Ukrainian language. For me, it was not a difference because I neither know Russian nor know the Ukrainian language. So far, I think this is mirroring the difficulties they have with themselves in their perception. And also, may I say that is one of the critiques I'm doing to the Russians. I think the old situations are coming back. I understand Putin and I understand Russia if they are not in favor that NATO is coming directly to the border of Russia. Here I'm fully sharing this opinion, and it was a mistake to do so. But on the other side, I think there came back the old impression of confrontation. That's a mistake on the Western side, especially by the Americans, but also of some Western Europeans. I have to say precisely Western Europeans, and also on the other side.
But come on, it's not only the Western Europeans. The Poles, for example, played also quite an active and divisive role.
This is history. I think the confrontation, Poland and Russia, is a long-lasting one. And I think it's also the question of consummation, what has happened by the end of the Second World War, because Poland was moved 200 kilometers westwards, losing its eastern parts and getting from Germany or Deutsches Reich or whatever you want to say, parts of their country. It is still not yet consumed.
So everybody is essentially acting on their old historical and sometimes mythical grievances.
Because it's primitive. I think you have not making any distinctions and you have nothing to consider. I think you are using the old formulas and the old divisions, and that's it.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's put history aside and let's try to look forward. I've heard you say that what Russia is currently interested in Ukraine is fermenting some sort of a frozen conflict. And I would not actually dispute that, because if you consider all possible alternatives, frozen conflict may not be desirable, but it may actually be a lesser evil, at least from the Russian point of view, because as you said, Russia indeed does not want to see NATO in Ukraine. Now, can I ask you about the European, specifically the EU position? What exactly the EU now wants to see in Ukraine? And I'm not asking you about best wishes. In the most practical terms, given the underlying causes of this conflict, what is the best possible scenario that the EU should be working toward?
I think I repeat, there's no real strategy of the European Union in Ukraine. There's a lot of different opinions within the European Union by the member states, for sure, which is quite okay that it is happening. And I think sometimes the reactions are really too primitive. I understand, I'm not happy about, but I understand this frozen conflict strategy of Putin, because it's giving possibility to influence the situation. Whenever he wants, he can open the conflict, he can close the conflict.
No, I don't think it's about opening or closing the conflict, but simply not letting NATO consume, in a strategic sense, consume Ukraine. But what I'm more interested in, again, is the European factor, because you remember people, when they took to the streets, they were chanting Ukraine is Europe, and what they meant by that is the European Union. Do they have any chance of realizing that European dream at this point?
I think you have to understand that for a very long time, and that I think even it's still now existing, there is, I think, an understanding Europe is European Union, which is not right, because not whole Europe is European Union for sure, that's quite clear, but that is the impression. And I think you should also understand the alternative of the countries coming out of the Soviet Empire by the downbreak of the Iron Curtain. I think their perspective was European Union. I think we want to go immediately to the European Union.
And I can tell you for sure that this was exactly what the Ukrainians had on their mind. Not the European culture, not the European music, but the European Union, the European standards of living, European institutions, and so on and so forth. And at that time, I think the leadership of the European Commission was encouraging that sentiment. Has it delivered on that?
Never giving a promise that Ukraine might become a member of the European Union. I think that was never promised.
Was it? Because I think many Ukrainians took it exactly like that.
That was never promised. There's no decision within the European Union that Ukraine might become member of the European Union. I think this is misunderstood or sometimes misused also by the understanding on the Russian side. I think he has no decision never done. It is always a phrase used, neighborhood policy. We need a European Union neighborhood policy.
But Dr. Busek, is that really fair? Because you know that in order to make that civilizational choice, as the Ukrainian politicians like to call it, they had to sever many of their economic ties with Russia. Many of the industrial ties were cut. Ukraine is now risking losing income from the gas transit. So Ukraine has made a lot of sacrifices for what? If it cut its ties with Russia, it surely hoped that it would be embraced by the West more fully, not just encouraged, but fully embraced and supported.
It is right if the Ukrainians want to have a perspective of the European Union, but this is not going from one day to the other. I think that's always misunderstood. You can become, with one switch, member of the European Union. You have to fulfill the conditions and there are a lot of consequences you have already mentioned here that need some time. You may write in these critiques that the representatives of the European Union were not rightly outspoken on this subject. I think they never contradicted to these hopes, but they were never delivering any decision opening this possibility. Personally, I'm convinced it might be right after 20, 30 years. I think you need some time to consume the results of history and. I think you cannot develop a common Europe within one switch and in a short time. I think it needs some time. We were proposing on the Austrian side several times to the Ukrainians they might declare neutrality, because we Austrians, we have a good experience also towards the Soviet Union in previous time. And here I learned that the Ukrainians were not really understanding this strategy, declaring neutrality.
Well, Dr. Busek, let me stop you right here. We have to take a very short break now, but we will be back in just a few moments. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Worlds Apart with Dr. Erhard Busek, former Vice-Chancellor of Austria. Dr. Busek, just before the break, you mentioned Austria's neutral status, and there was a time when Ukraine also enjoyed that status and was quite content with it. Unfortunately, that's no longer the case. According to polls, the majority of Ukrainians now strongly favor joining of NATO. And that may be Russia's fault. That may have been provoked by Russia's own policy. But the thing is, it seems that NATO is not ready or willing to reciprocate, not only because of the fears of provoking Russia, but frankly because of Ukraine's own internal security and economic risks. What kind of a relationship do you think the West can now realistically offer to Ukraine as far as integration or security matters go?
Again, I'm repeating what I have said. There's no real strategy concerning Ukraine within the European Union.
Just the abstract discussion about the values, but nothing in concrete.
Nothing in concrete. I think there was never done a real decision what to offer Ukraine. But what is really more important, and you have always to look, there is a part of members in the European Union saying, we cannot offer a strategy to the Ukrainians because Russia does not want it. That plays a very important role for some who are very cautious on this subject. I am not quite sure that there was really a precise discussion with the Russians how to manage the problem.
I totally agree with you. Moreover, I think Russians really feel the need now to put their conflict with Ukraine to rest, and hopefully have Europe or the European Union take some responsibility for what transpired in that country, because Ukraine is in a difficult financial position now. It needs some sources of income, and it's not quite obvious how it can substitute for the lost income from the severe economic ties with Russia. Do you think the association agreement that was, again, the sort of the beginning point for this conflict,
difficulties,
do you think it provides enough for Ukraine to carry on?
I think association agreement is not enough. I think there are also necessary changes within the Ukraine. I think concerning how economy is done, legislation and so on and so on. And there are a lot of hints and also proposals by the European Union what should change. The real problem internally in the Ukrainian is the decision-making on this subject. There are a lot of differences, not only between West and East here in this context, also in which strategy it can be really done. I think it's a question of political management. Here, Ukraine has to learn to be independent because they have been for a very long time part of the Soviet Empire.
But isn't that a little bit cruel? I mean, Ukraine had some sort of a symbiotic relationship with Russia. That relationship was cut very dramatically on the pretext that, Ukraine should aspire to brighter Western values. And now people in the West are telling Ukraine, come on, you are on your own. We support you, but you're really on your own, despite the fact that it has a very difficult situation, not only with Russia, but also with other neighbors, because it does not want to be part of the customs union, which complicates its trade with other countries of the former Soviet Union. Is that really fair? Is that a fair position?
My dear, this is a problem of such tremendous changes. I think to leave the Soviet Empire from one day to the other does not mean that you are able to handle the things on your own way. I think here you need steps and bitter experiences. Even if you see the reunification of the both Germanys has still consequences and difficulties internally, which are not yet done. And even concerning Ukraine, it's even more important because here the cuts were for sure even more important. Also concerning the specific energy situation, but not only on this. I think you can see Crimea, okay, now taken by the Russians, but it is also a problem for the Russians and it costs a lot of money.
Well, it costs a lot of money, but I think that I know that you believe that Crimea is not a finished issue, and I actually agree with you on that. I think there will come a time when Russia will make an accommodation to Ukraine on the issue of Crimea, not necessarily changing the borders, but I'm pretty sure that Russia will, at some point of time, make sure that Ukrainians feel very welcome in Crimea. This is the only way for Russia to patch its difficulties with Ukraine.
You are really right.
Now, you mentioned the energy issue, and this is very interesting because 3 years ago we heard about the unified Western position on Ukraine, but now it's not even clear what the West really means. Take, for example, the second Nord Stream pipeline. We have the Americans who are strongly against it. We have the Germans and the Austrians who are for it. Do they even have the Ukrainian interest? Any one of them, do they have the Ukrainian interest in mind? Because there seems to be that each country is pursuing their own economic...
My dear, I have to defend the Austrians. So what we did is to do some changes concerning some pipelines that we are able to send energy, in this sense, oil or gas, even back to Ukraine. Here we did it, but we are playing a minor role on this. I think the whole situation is under tremendous changes, and for sure The real background is, I think we need a certain way of regulation in the relations between Russia on the one side and the European Union on the other side. I think the energy problem you have to see in a global context even. And I think there are not enough talks on both sides in this direction.
But when you specifically consider that issue of gas transit, on the one hand, Ukraine needs that kind of income from gas transit. On the other hand, you don't want to be worrying about the supply of gas every winter. Who do you think and how do you think that decision should be made, whether or not that project should be given a green light if you put Ukraine at the center of all of this?
I think it cannot be done only by the Ukraine. And I think we need a general arrangement, which is obviously extremely difficult because all the arrangements looking, for example, to the Minsk agreement, it does not really work because it's not really fulfilled under all conditions. This is a very good example because I think it's even more urgent than the energy question because here we need peace and such a high number of victims still existing. I think here we need another behavior concerning negotiations and how they are really fulfilled. I think the talks should be quite more open and straight to the subject. Well,
Americans seem to be playing a very active role, and there seems to be some progress as far as the American representative on Ukraine is concerned. He's trying to get some deal on the UN peacekeeping force, and I think Russia would generally be in favor of that. But the problem is again whether the Ukrainian side will be able to cooperate, because politically its options are very limited.
They have to fulfill some conditions internally, and I think here I may say on the side of the European Union we have to have more talks with the Ukrainian concerning fulfillment. There are also different positions within Ukraine on the subject. I have quite a good knowledge about the Western Ukraine, or former Galicia, if we may say. Here the positions are quite different as to the East. And sometimes it is more not a principal position, but that some politicians might lose respect because they have promised things which are not very realistic, and so on and so on. There's too much politics in a bad way on this way.
Now, I think it's indisputable that what Ukrainians wanted during the Maidan protests was the change of formation, the change of economic and governing model. And I think it would be fair to say that so far they only got the change of leadership. It's the governing model has not yet fully been transformed, but I know there are lots of people in Russia who would eagerly blame Poroshenko for that, but if we are really fair, it is a major problem for all post-communist societies. It's extremely difficult to grow your institutions. I know that you have a special expertise in that area. Do we understand at this point of time what it takes to move from post-authoritarian, post-communist societies into a stronger democratic ones?
It is a learning process, and you need efforts, I think, that you are willing to learn. And here's a difficulty by acting politicians and by political strategists and so on, because a lot of countries are using the difficulties for their own purpose internally and so on and so on. I think some parties are really living out of this and raising some question. I think if one neighboring country is saying, oh, it's nice, give us back the Carpato Ukraine for Hungary, it's not helpful. I think so far, we have to put out some other questions and really be concerned to move on. For sure, there are tremendous changes within Ukraine necessary to develop more democracy. But I want to be fair, that needs a lot of time and experience, and it needs a lot of training. So far, I'm very much looking always to education.
There are some other examples in Eastern Europe that many in Western Europe are somewhat concerned about. Hungary, Poland. Those countries are sometimes accused of being increasingly authoritarian. Do you see that in the same light, that they are sort of going back in history, returning to the most authoritarian instincts? Or is it just a normal learning curve? Sometimes you go forward, sometimes you relapse. Is that part of growing that democratic muscle, or is that already something to be worried about?
I think here I want to be quite outspoken. This judgment which is happening in Hungary and on Poland and so on is a pure nonsense. I think it's mixed up with history. In one point, Viktor Orban is totally right. I think communism in Hungary was not really changed, or there was no learning curve on this, moving out of this. They switched from communistic state to democracy immediately. I think even it was very nice that the new government, which was an old communist government in Hungary, put down their party books and the problem was finished. It's not yet finished. I think you need some time to consume and to get step by step other.
Well, you certainly cannot change societies by political declarations. And I think there are lots of studies these days about values in many post-communist societies, and you see a very significant change on many social issues like the LGBT, migration, abortion, and many similar issues. There is a divide between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, and up until recently, I think the position of the Western Europe has been that you guys have to play by, you have to be like us, you have to accept our values, and that's pretty much it. Don't you think that what we are seeing in Poland, in Hungary, maybe even in Russia, is a sort of a pushback against this kind of moralistic supremacy?
Here you are totally right. I think the strategy which was done, you have to change from one day to the other, is a pure nonsense. You need some time and you need a specific kind of dialogue. I would even say empathy to have an understanding, which is partly missing. I'm working on the subject for a very long time, and I'm preaching it in my own country and also in Western European countries, that they need another perception of consuming history and consequences out of this, for sure. It is a learning process, which are making it difficulties. It hurts sometimes, without any doubt. But I think there's also necessary quite patience. I'm missing, for example, even by my own country or by the government of my country, a certain kind of dialogue. I think we had better times after the downfall of the Iron Curtain with our neighboring countries as we have nowadays, because I think we are doing so that we know everything and they are wrong. I think this is wrong. I think you have to understand why they are doing so and start a discussion on the subject where might be some mistakes and which steps you can do and so on.
Well, Dr. Busek, it's been a great pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for your time. And to our viewers, please share your comments on our Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube pages. And I hope to see you again, same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.